can say the first 11 Imams, that their lives all had unique circumstances related to them. No two Imams really had a similar experience in life or really even in their death. You know, you just have to go back to the time of Amir al-Mu'mineen, look at the challenges he faced, being looked over for the Khilafat for over 25 years. You look at the life of Imam Hassan, which I might touch upon briefly tonight, and you see the challenges that he faced with the political and the social climate that he lived within. And obviously, as we go down the line, the third Imam, fourth Imam, till the 11th, and even the 12th, we see that each and every one of them had gone through severe challenges and challenges also to their own imamate in a sense. And although we believe when we study history from a purely analytical perspective that each of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt had a sense of madlumiyah, of being oppressed by the people of their time, by the Bani Umayyah, the Umayyad dynasty, or the Abbasid dynasty, one of the tragedies of the life of Imam Hassan, peace be upon him, is one in which not only was he attacked from the non-adherents, those who did not believe in his imamate, those who were from the Banu Umayyah primarily, but those who did not submit and acknowledge the authority of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. But history shows us that even those within his so-called camp, those who would be, today we could call them the Shi'as, those who follow the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, to an extent, even these people were against Imam Hassan, to the point where we have a hadith where when he had to so-called abdicate and allow Muawiyah, lanatullah alayhi, to take over or to take control of the community, people would go around. These were people who so-called loved Imam Hassan alayhi salam, and they would say to him whenever they would greet him in the streets of Medina, they would greet him and say to him, "Peace be upon you, ya mudhill al-mu'mineen." Right? Peace be upon you, O the one who brought embarrassment and shame upon the believers. That you were not like a mountain for the believers, you are the one who brought humiliation upon the community. And unfortunately, because the people of his time, again the so-called Shias, they couldn't understand why Imam Hassan alayhi salam, why he would sign a treaty, a peace treaty with the likes of Muawiyah and others who were within that camp of Muawiyah. They couldn't understand why the grandson of Rasulullah would submit, what they would be calling it as giving in to the people of Sham, because they could not understand the greater wisdom that Imam Hassan alayhi salam had. They looked at it as an embarrassment, as a source of the Muslims being given, the believers being kind of giving a role of subjugation in the community. But as believers today, when we look back at it for 1400 years later, we recognize that whatever the Imams of Ahlul Bayt do, whatever the Ahlul Bayt in general do, the 14 infallibles, whatever they do is for a wisdom. They don't make mistakes. They don't second guess the situation. They don't, err in their judgment calls. Right? And so whatever Imam Hassan did, alayhi salam, vis-a-vis Muawiyah and the politics that he was playing, was exactly what he was required to do as the representative of Allah. And so although he did not rise up in war, and his younger brother Imam Hussein alayhi salam did what he had to do against Yazid on the day of Ashura, that doesn't diminish it, and it doesn't mean that Imam Hussein is a greater Imam than Imam Hassan. No, they're both Imams, as even the Prophet would be quoted as saying. The Prophet of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The Prophet would be quoted as saying that Imam Hassan and Hussein, or Al-Hassan and Hussein, are Imams. Whether they rise up, whether they stand up in an offensive move, in a revolution we call it, if we want to call it that, or whether they sit down, whether they go through diplomatic means due to the circumstances they lived in. And so we have to respect both, again, because many times people look at Imam Hassan and they say, well, why didn't he not revolt? Why did he not launch a war against Muawiyah? And obviously the rationale why he did not do that is vast. I don't want to look at that tonight. That would involve us going back through 20, 30 years of history, recognizing what happened at the time of his father, recognizing the politics of the Banu Umayyah. But I just want to leave it at that as I move on to the theme for tonight, for us to recognize that whatever Imam Hassan did, alayhi salam, in the time that he had, it was to strengthen the community, it was to give the believers that resolve, and also to learn a lesson that there are times when the war is necessary, and there are times when peace is necessary. And ultimately, especially when it comes to the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, as I said, I'll repeat as I move on, that whatever the Imam does is exactly what Allah expects from that ma'asum, from that infallible individual. We never should second guess and ask why an Imam does this, why the Imam says certain things, why the Imam uses certain language. No, ultimately we recognize that they knew the situation, they knew the instance why they were doing what they had to do, and ultimately, obviously, 14 centuries later, we don't even have a complete picture of the society of that time for us to come and, hypothesize that why didn't the Imam do this? Why didn't he do that? So with that, I want to move on to my topic for tonight. And I've chosen a hadith that I want to look at from Imam Hassan alayhi salam, in which he gives us ways or a way to run and govern our lives. Now the hadith is a bit lengthy, so hopefully we will be able to make our way through it and do justice to the words of the Imam. But the Imam in this hadith, as a preamble, let me mention that he, in this hadith, tackles our relationship with everything around us. As believers, we know that Allah has a right above us. We know that our religious community, our faith community that we are in tonight, that the people of this community, they have rights upon us. And those who are alive have rights, and those who have left this world, they have rights above us as well. And ultimately, if you look at it from one perspective, in Islam, within the framework of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, we are not merely individuals living our own personal lives. Islam recognizes us as individuals, definitely, but ultimately as individuals, we make up a larger collective. We make up initially a family. So you have a mother, a father, and as the family grows, children are there, cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents. But each individual plays a role within that family. As we grow and mature, we form religious communities such as this. Religious communities means that each one of us as individuals become a part of a larger collective. Within this larger collective, we also have rights and responsibilities. And when you look at the world around us, right, where we live in Canada, we live in London, Ontario, we also have responsibilities to those people that we live around. All of these, as we know, are to be governed by the rules of Islam. So Islam, the Quran, have laid down the methodology amongst how a family has to live. The Quran speaks about the first relationship of Adam and Eve, Adam and Hawa, peace be upon both of them, the relationship that they formed under the bonds of matrimony. Allah speaks about their children, Habil and Qabil, Cain and Abel, and the unfortunate reality of what I could call sibling rivalry, of how one brother becomes jealous and unfortunately kills his own blood brother. But we see in the Quran that all of these relationships get played out. Fathers, mothers, husband, wife, brother, sister, siblings. All of these relationships take place in the Quran, in the Hadith, in the history of Islam, in the time of the Prophet and the Imams and before them, all for us to also gain lessons from. Because ultimately the Quran is a guidebook providing that guidance for us, or at least it should be. The Prophet and his family, peace be upon all of them, are our guides in this life to get to the world to come. And so through all of these, we recognize that although we are individuals, we all have our own lifestyle, we have everything which is related to me as a human being. I'm not the same as my brother or my sister or my other siblings or my family. But at the same time, Allah shows us that you have an obligation when you live in a society. And so in the hadith that I want to mention tonight from Imam Hassan, alayhi salam, he breaks down our responsibilities at 3 levels. He'll talk about, as we will see, our connection to Allah, our responsibility we have to Allah. He will then look at our responsibility to those who are alive, our community, our family, the society around us, and even those who have left this world, the deceased. They also have a rights over us. And so as the Imam begins the hadith, it mentions in the tradition that a man comes to Imam Hassan. A man comes to him and he says to the Imam, he says that, what is a siyasa? Right? What does it mean to be diplomatic? Or what does it mean to have relationships with other people, right? Or others in general? So how do you moderate and govern and base your life? How do you maintain all of these various relationships that we are expected to have? And the very first thing the Imam says, he says in this tradition, he says that a siyasa, what I might translate as policy making or good practice in how to live, he says is that you observe the rights of Allah. He says that number 2, it's that you observe the rights of the living. And number 3, that you observe the rights of those who have passed away, who have left this world. And then he begins to break it down for this man of what he means at each and every one of these stages. At the first level, he says, فَأَمَّا حُقُوقُ اللَّهِ, the rights of Allah. What rights do Allah have over us? Right? Is it just that Allah created you and I and left us on earth and that we have no responsibility? Because this is a notion that some people in our society have. You know, that we were brought onto this earth, those who especially don't believe in God, who don't believe in Allah, they say, well, we were born, we come on this earth, we live for 40, 50, 60 years. Nothing will remove us except for dahar, for time. Right? People say nature, nature took them away. It's a part of living is that you die. Right? And obviously as believers, we reject that. We don't believe that we were just created out of fluke or a random event happened in the cosmos and somehow all of the factors became ideal for life to exist on earth and somehow life just created out of nothing. No, we as Muslims believe that Allah created everything. He put us on earth for a purpose. We have a reason why we are here. We're not created out of vain. Allah says in the Quran, أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّمَا خَلَقَنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا? Do you people think that you were created for no purpose? You're just put on earth, out of a random freak experiment, and that we would not go back to Allah? No, the Quran says, no, we will all go back to God. We were brought on this earth for a reason. We have a purpose in life, and we have to recognize what that purpose is and strive to get to where Allah wants us to be. So the Imam says, as for the rights of Allah, what does the right of Allah over us? He says it's 2 things, and really this is all Islam is. Everything that we do as Muslims, the praying, the fasting, Hajj if we have the ability, the sadaqat, the khums, the zakat, the charity, everything that you and I do in this religion, the sisters that wear hijab, the brothers that keep the beard, all of these obligations that Allah has on us can be broken down into 2 things in the words of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. He says it is فَأَدَاءُ مَا تُلِبْ وَاجْتِنَابُ أَمَّا نُهِيَ. Is to perform, is to do those actions to fulfill that which Allah has ordered, that He wants from us, and to keep away from everything which He has told us to keep away from. That really, in a nutshell, brothers and sisters, is Islam. Somebody asks you, what is Islam about? Define your religion for me. As a non-believer, I want to know about Islam. That's what it is to obey God in whatever He told us to do, and whatever He told us to keep away from, we refrain from it. Now, people may ask at a stage deeper, or one level deeper, well, why? A lot of the times we have this question, why are we expected to do certain actions and keep away from certain things? We have another answer for that, but again, generally it goes back to the first response, that we do what we do in religion because God expects it from us. even if in the religion, in the Quran or the Hadith, if we find that we don't have a reason why we are obligated to do certain things, we always need to remember at the forefront of our mind is because Allah told us to do something. Now that doesn't mean that we don't know, that we follow blindly to an extent. Yes, to an extent we follow blindly because sometimes only Allah will tell us why we do certain things. Prime example, or why we don't do certain things. Prime example is fasting in the month of Ramadan. God tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah that He implemented fasting. Kutiba alaykumus siyam kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. Fasting has been prescribed for you just as the nations that came before you fasted, so that you may perhaps gain in your taqwa, your proximity, your awareness of God, your consciousness of knowing who you are, of why you follow this religion. So people could say, well, the philosophy of fasting is to get closer to God, to recognize our humanity and to follow orders, to get to a better status in this world and the world to come. But is that the real reason of fasting? Definitely not. The real reason is only known by Allah, but He's told us that this is an outcome, this is a possibility of the fast. You look at, for example, one of the, or two of the biggest sins in religion, which are so common in the world, in Canada, and which are legalized. Alcohol and gambling, right? Two of the greatest sins, the major sins, which have the maximum return and benefit to a person, but which also are the most destructive to the human society. Intoxicants, alcohol and drugs. Right? No doubt that people enjoy themselves. You look at the secular world of people that drink and do drugs and how much so-called fun they have. And you look at people who invest in alcohol and in the drug industry, how much money you can make in the stock market on these two areas. You look at gambling, right? Just what last month there was a lottery in America, the Powerball, $1.4 billion lottery ticket. Who can deny a $2 ticket could make you a billionaire overnight, that there's no benefit in that? There's benefit from a worldly perspective. But the same Allah that tells us in the Quran that in alcohol or intoxicants and in gambling that there is benefit, Allah says there's a benefit in this, but there's a sin. Allah says the sin is much more potent than the benefit. And you just have to study the rates of alcohol abuse, of spousal abuse, when a guy is drunk and he beats up his wife and children. People who drink and drive and kill people. People who, use drugs and are intoxicated and they go and they do crimes that are unimaginable that they would never do in a sound mind. Right? You look at the rates of people who win millions of dollars in the lottery, and how many times they come back and they say that this was the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life. You'd think, well, how can it be bad? You win 10, 20, 50 million dollars, but you read their lives and the misery that they go through, and you and I realize. Now, is that why Allah made alcohol or intoxicants and gambling haram? No, that's not the reason, but there is a real reason why Allah did it. But even if we don't know it, we go back to the principle, which is that Allah is the creator, He's the lawgiver, and whatever He says goes. We don't question authority. Just as we don't question a police officer when we get stopped for speeding or doing something. We don't have a debate with the officer, and try and bring out the Canadian Criminal Code book and argue with him and say that on page 85 it says this about driving or whatever. We pay the fine. So in Islam, as the Imam is saying, that the right of Allah is that He has the right to be obeyed. Whatever He tells you and I to do, we might not, make the most sense or understanding of it. We might even think this is illogical. Why would Allah do this? But we take it. And that goes for everything. Let me just mention one example as I move on, is that, and I've heard this so many times, that people say in the rules of fiqh, in the rules that we follow, that when you and I travel, when we go past a certain distance from our house, so let's say you're traveling from London, you're going to Toronto for a weekend, we all know that it becomes an obligation in general issues to break our salat, to pray qasr. So your fajr stays at 2, but dhuhr, asr, and isha go from 4 rakat to 2. This is a rule or a blessing Allah has given us. And I would say 99.9% of our ulama, the top maraja, they all have the ruling that when you travel and all the other rules are met, you are obligated to pray your salat in the shortened form. Many times people ask myself and others that, today it's so easy. London to Toronto, 2-hour drive, but it's not hard. And even if it is hard, it's my mom or dad who is driving. I'm sitting in the back seat, playing a game or watching a movie. I'm not stressed out, so why do I have to pray qasr? Right? Nowadays, people with their self-driving cars, you can just go on the highway and your car drives for you, so there's no stress on it. But again, when we see that Allah has told us that there are certain rules that He has put into place, even though they don't make sense to us, qasr salat does not make sense to me. I came from Kitchener tonight to London, Ontario, 1-hour drive, but it did not make me tired. I didn't come on a camel or a horse. I'm not fatigued in any way. So why do I still have to play by the rules of Allah? Simply put, because Allah is the one who tells me what to do. And so why do I even want to question and bring that possibility that I would have to pray 4 rakat, right? Enjoy the fact that Allah has given us the blessings. He's allowed us this opportunity. He knows better in His wisdom why He put this rule into place. And there's hundreds of other rules like this. But recognize that these are blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But ultimately they are a test of will we follow the rules and the regulations that Allah has put into this religion. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. From here, let me take the next part of the hadith where the second Imam says, as for the rights of the living, and he mentions a few different things that the living have as a right over us. The very first thing he says is that you need to uphold your responsibilities to your brethren, to your brothers and sisters, in faith primarily, right? That doesn't mean that non-Muslims don't have rights over us. No, even non-believers, our neighbors who are non-Muslims, we are expected to respect them, treat them with respect. In fact, some of the hadith tell us that when it comes to the rights of the neighbors, right, the Prophet has been quoted as saying that, or Amir al-Mu'mineen rather is quoted as saying that Rasulullah advised me about the rights of my neighbors to such an extent that I thought he was about to tell me that they would inherit from me. Right. Now, neighbors don't inherit, but they have a lot of rights, whether they're Muslim or not. Something as simple as when we do a barbecue in the summer. Who here doesn't barbecue outside in the summer? Hadith even tell us that if you're cooking, you should try and ensure that the good smell of your food doesn't drift over to your neighbor's house. Because what if they can't afford the kind of food you're eating? Or their children maybe would love to have a burger or a hot dog and they smell it, but they know that their mom and dad can't buy it or they don't have it in the freezer today and they can't go and buy it. So we have a hadith that even tell us to be careful when you cook food or when you bring a gift for your children. Try and make sure that your neighbor's children don't see you taking a gift to your children because maybe they can't afford it or whatever the case may be. Children are children. They'll say, oh, Mom, guess what? Our neighbor, they brought their kids the PS5 or they brought them this or they brought them that. Can I have it as well? So the hadith tell us even non-believing neighbors, they have rights even to that level. But in this hadith, the Imam is talking about the rights of the followers of the religion of Islam, the followers of the Prophet, those who follow this tradition of Al-Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. And he says, Sallallahu Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He says, your first right over the living is that you uphold the rights of these individuals, your brothers and sisters in religion. Now, even that in itself, by me saying this, I've opened up a can of worms because what are the rights of the believers, you might ask? And when the sixth Imam was asked about this, he said that the believer has 70 rights over another believer. 70. Right? Some hadith or scholars will say that, and this is general speaking, is that 70 in the hadith doesn't mean literally 70 as opposed to 69 or 72. It means there are countless rights that we have over one another. And there are books, for example, the late Shaikh Saduq has a book on the rights of the believers. They list some of them in the hadith. Other scholars have tried to enumerate from multiple hadith by picking and choosing from the traditions. What do we have as rights over one another? But to just give it short and move on in the hadith, the second Imam is saying, we have rights to fulfill over one another. The living, all of us, we have rights that believers have. Again, there's so many, I don't want to just pick one or two, but just to mention that this is something that we have to look into. We want to be at the level of the mu'minun, of the believers, and that means it's not just saying that I believe, right? It's doing, it's putting your money where your mouth is, to making sure that we are fulfilling our obligations once we come into this umbrella of Islam. Let me move on. The second thing the Imam says in the rights of the living, he says is that you never stop or delay in serving your community. Right? You never stop serving your community. This is really important, brothers and sisters. Out of all of the things the second Imam could have said is, don't ever stop being a khadim, a servant in your community. Serving humanity is one thing, but making sure your community is looked after. And this is why we see so much of an emphasis in Islam on volunteerism. Right? People that volunteer, let's say in Muharram or Shahr Ramadan, they come to the center, they're out there directing traffic, they're helping the believers park their cars. People will come and vacuum the center, people will serve food, people will organize programs, they'll come early and on the lights and turn everything on. They'll leave at the end. When all of us leave, the volunteers will be here for half an hour, cleaning and vacuuming. All of these things which many times we might not even feel compelled or interested in doing, the Imam is saying never stop serving your community and serving humanity on a whole. And this is something, brothers and sisters, that the hadith show us that it has a rank which is unbelievable actually. We're told in the hadith that as long as you continue to serve your community or you serve society or humanity, Allah continues to send His blessings upon you. But the hadith says, once you stop being a servant to the community, Allah says, or the hadith says, Allah begins to remove His blessings from you, and He transports those blessings to somebody else who is serving the community. So we have to be thinking about, how can I serve? If you run the Sunday school, and if you feel you can be a teacher, you can offer your services, register, sign up, say, I want to teach the next generation. Maybe you can't be a teacher, you can be a TA, a teaching assistant. You can be a volunteer in this school, you can provide lunch, you can be supervising the kids at break time, something to volunteer to help the generation to come. The point is that as Imam Hassan, he says that don't ever delay and don't ever stop your services in your community. And obviously, once we can take care of our faith community, then we should be out there volunteering in the greater public, right? There are so many causes within, I'm sure in this city, and every city and country that the local, city councils and local community organizations need volunteers in. As a community of believers, we should be trying to step up, volunteer. There are many projects that come up. There are homeless shelters, food banks, so many things that we should try and volunteer at, to let the society know that we as Muslims are not just here to leech off the system, to make benefit and not give back. No, that we are believers, we are a part and parcel of Canadian society, we're a part of the fabric of this community, and we are giving back to the society. Because our Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, alayhum as-salam, they expect this from us, to be servants of society. The Imam then goes on to say, and that you deal with your leader with truthfulness and sincerity, just as he deals with his community in the same way. Right? Leadership obviously is another topic in and of itself. Who are the leaders of a community? How do you choose the leaders of a society? The Imam may have been speaking about it at the level of the Muslim Ummah in general, the leaders of the political society at that time, or in future times. But I think we can also take from this hadith and look at it at a very down-to-earth level, at our communal level, when we appoint executive committees, when we have leaders in our religious communities, where even maybe in our local level of local politics, is that we deal with all of these individuals just as we want them to deal with us. Unfortunately today we see in the world of politics, whether it's Canadian politics or our politics back home in our home countries, that leaders unfortunately are some of the worst people. Unfortunately we see this, and we don't even have to go back home. You look at Canada, you look at the dirty politics, unfortunately, that are played, especially at the time of elections. But we have to keep in mind that at one level, we, in a way, deserve the leaders that we get. And at the same time, we also create the leaders that we get. At a communal level, at a city level, at a provincial, at a federal level, we are almost, in a way, responsible, accountable for who we put into leadership. But the Imam says that, you need to deal with them as you want them to deal with you. Right? That means that if we expect a level of respect from our leaders, we have to be respectful back to them. We may disagree with them, but we have to be respectfully disagreeing with them. Provide solutions rather than always critiquing and giving, just negative criticism. Show them where we feel that they're wrong. Right? And that means we have to educate them on the Islamic teachings as well, on what does it mean to have good governance from a religious perspective. And really, when I think about this, the only thing that can come to my mind is the very famous letter that Amir al-Mu'mineen gave to Malik al-Ashtar when he appointed him as the governor of Egypt. He gave him a lengthy letter on what good governance is, how to run society, how to run a community, how to run a country, how to deal with people of other religions. Right? And these are the kinds of teachings that have to be taught to others. They might not be Muslims, but they have to be shown that, look, this is a basis of Islam. This is the basis of governance that you need to look at. And personally speaking, when we've reached out to non-Muslims and showed them this is the ways of Islam, they've actually reciprocated and say that we are looking and we're studying, and we hope that we can implement the teachings that your religion teaches. So it's not some mythical pie in the sky that we cannot convey. No, we have the ability, we have the teachings. We just have to get out and try and show the community that the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, the Quran, that they have the lessons and they have the teachings needed to rule and to govern benevolently and with love and with compassion and with care. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The last part of this portion of the hadith about how we deal with the living around us, the Imam says, and that you work to guide your people back to the straight path when you see them slipping away and taking a wrong course in life. As believers, we know as human beings that we are all prone to making mistakes in life. Nobody is perfect other than the 14 infallibles and the previous prophets and their successors. We are all prone to mistakes. But how you and I deal with people who make mistakes is a different story. Many times, when people make mistakes, when they sin, when they make wrong judgment calls, we want to excommunicate them. We want to push them out of the family. We want to banish them from the community. We don't want to accept that they may have made an honest error and an honest misjudgment call. And rather than us having empathy with that person and understanding that they made a mistake and letting them explain themselves, we go to the other extreme where we vilify them, we attack them, we deal with them in social media with accusations. Nowadays, the trend is to make videos replying to this person and that person, and people will spend hours formulating responses saying that this person did this, and this is where they're wrong, and they will attack them and they will make fun of them. They'll mock their family. They'll speak about their personal qualities, right? Rather than maybe going to the person and speaking to them, and maybe they made an honest mistake, maybe they were intentionally trying to misguide or mislead people, but rather than going and talking to them one-to-one, we go to social media. We go to the major platforms and begin to level accusations against fellow followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. We'll accuse them of being agents of various governments. We'll accuse them of being deviants. We'll accuse them of being misguided and trying to misguide others intentionally. We'll use all of these various tools to do character assassination and destroy a person rather than trying to understand. Now, I'm not saying that, that person or those people that engage in those actions are innocent. No, you may come to a conclusion by speaking to them, by analyzing them, that they are definitely wrong and their motives are that they have ulterior motives. If that's the case, then obviously there's another path to take. But we have to recognize that, at the first level, we give people the benefit of the doubt. We assume that they made a mistake, that they were incorrect. And if we push it further and we recognize that that they have an agenda or ulterior motives, then obviously we deal it with another way. But the Imam says that before you destroy a person, before you drag their name through the mud, he says try to bring them back to the right course. Right? Try to understand that they may have seriously made an honest mistake. But bring them back, try to bring them back. Again, and if they don't, or if they don't want to listen, or they have, again, their own agenda, then that's a different story. But many times there are minor issues that happen, and we don't want to sit and listen because it's quicker or it's easier to respond, to retaliate, to accuse. And it takes more time to listen and talk to somebody and understand their viewpoint. So the Imam says that, look, one of the rights of the living is that when they make a mistake, they slip, you allow them to explain themselves. Try to bring them back to the path. But again, there may be times when that is not possible. The third part of the hadith, and as we move on, is where he talks about the hukuk, the rights of the amwat, of those who have left this world. And traditionally we think about it, we think, okay, well, somebody lived 40, 50 years in our community, they died. We will go for the burial, the funeral, we buried them. Now there's nothing else. There's no other rights that they have, we tend to think. But the Imam shows us that no, when you lose a member of your community or your family, those people still have rights above us. Right? They still have an honor, a level of respect, of dignity. There are still things that they have, rights that they have that we have to respect for them. The first thing the Imam says is that you remember their good actions. And this is one of the beautiful things I've seen in many of the communities I've visited, that, every month, some communities every week, but usually every month, they'll make a trip to the graveyard, the local graveyard. They'll have a short program at the graveyard. A person will give a lecture, they'll recite Surah Yasin, maybe Ziyarat Ashura. They'll have a bit of food. And what they'll do is they'll kind of just walk by all the graves. And they'll say, yeah, this person, he was the pioneer. He came from this country in the 80s or 70s, and he started to build the community. This person, they did this service. This person, they did that. This person, they used their basement for the first majalis in Muharram. And so they keep alive the memory of the people who have left by walking through the graveyard and remembering the names of the deceased. Or, for example, other communities where they'll publish a directory, not only of the members of the community, but at the back of the directory, they'll have a list of all of the members that have passed away and where in the local cemetery they're buried. Right? This allows us to remember that these were people who came before us, maybe the pioneers of a community, and that they've left a lasting impression on that community. The Imam says you need to remember the people who have passed away. What good have they done? Right? It might not be that they gave $1 million to build the center, but you know what? Every little thing that somebody has done is something that we remember and that we owe it to them to remember their legacy. In our society in Canada, it's not about the services many times, it's about how much money you give. So you have all these billionaires and their foundations that they'll donate $500,000 here, $1 billion there, $300 million to this cause. But it's not about the money, brothers and sisters. It's about what impact are you leaving on society, right? There are people, again, I've seen in many of my travels. They're in a community. They're there for a few months, for a year, for a few weeks. They started a sunnah, a practice in the community, and then they passed away. Literally, they passed away in that city. And now every time when people go to the graveyard, they look at that man's grave, the tombstone, and they say, yeah, you know that person came to this city, and they established this particular program in our community, which we still do until today. So we have to remember that our deceased loved ones that are in the graves, they have rights above us. And as community members, and especially the leaders of communities, we have to ensure that we keep the legacy of those individuals alive. We don't let their names be forgotten. The second thing the Imam says about the deceased is that he says you overlook their transgressions. We know that we're all fallible individuals. We all make mistakes. We could all go to the local graveyard tomorrow and look at the names of all of the people who have passed away from the London community. And I'm sure we could say, oh yeah, I know that person. They were like this. I know that lady, she was like that. That person did this. That person couldn't stop doing backbiting. That person was violent. This person was rude. But the Imam is saying, you know what? Once they've left this world, don't talk about them in a negative way. Whatever they were was between them and Allah. I'm reminded of the words, if you've ever been to a funeral and we do the Salatul Mayyit, we recite the 5 takbirs, right? And after every takbir, there's a dua. Or between those 5 takbirs, between the 5 takbirs, there's a dua that we recite after each one. And after one of them, we say, Allahumma inna la na'lamu minhu illa khayran. Oh Allah, we know nothing of this person except for goodness. They could be an alcoholic, they could have been the worst of people. But at that time, when their books are sealed, Allah is telling us, you only think good of that person. You may have seen them do bad, but did you see them do tawbah at night? You may have heard them use foul language in the daytime, but were you at their home in the middle of the night when they woke up for Salatul Layl and they asked Allah for istighfar for the words that they said? Right? You and I only see each other for a few hours in person. And you may see somebody do something bad, but you don't see them at home. When they go back home and they ask for repentance and they turn back to Allah. So the Imam says that think nothing but good about people. Right? Think nothing but good. And we remember Abu Abdullah when Hur comes to him. And Hur says to Imam Hussein alayhi salam that, I'm guilty for what I've done. I prevented you from moving forward to Kufa. I prevented you from going back to Medina. Is there any room for me for having tawbah? And the Imam doesn't say you're damned to hell. Forget about it. Just give up on life. No, he says if you have turned to God, then God has surely turned back to you. You are free in the name of Allah. Right? And then he says, even when he's about to die, he says, you are Hur. You are free just as your mother named you. Hur in this world and in the world to come. The Imam didn't sit above the body of Hur on the day of Ashura and say, yeah, Hur, you did this and that to me and you prevented me. And no, he forgot about it all. Remember the goodness of the person. Imam Hassan says that this is an obligation, a right of that deceased, that you don't talk about their bad. Just leave it with them and Allah. Pray for Allah to forgive them just as you and I want Allah to forgive us when we break the rules of Allah. And the next thing the Imam says, and I will end with this, and why does he say that? He basically summarizes this hadith about the rights of Allah, the rights of the living and the rights of the dead. He says ultimately why we do all of this, he says, is because when you remember the good of the people who have left this world and you forget the bad, he says because they have a Lord who will take them to account for their deeds. All of us, we know that on the day of judgment, Allah will take us to account. Just as you and I want Allah to deal with us with His rahmah, not with His justice. Allah, deal with us with your mercy and your compassion. So the Imam is saying, when you look at the people who have left this world, expect them and expect nothing but good for them, because just as you and I want Allah to deal with us with goodness and His benevolence and His mercy, we should expect the same thing from those people. If they were truly sinners and they never repented, like the killers who were responsible for the death of Imam Hassan alayhi salam, Allah will deal with them with His justice. There are times where Allah will deal with His mercy, and there are times when Allah will deal with His justice. Ultimately, we expect Allah to deal with everybody based on how He wants to deal with them. We can make dua for people. We can ask Allah to remove His mercy from people, to evoke the la'nat of Allah upon them. But ultimately, Allah will deal with everybody based on what they deserve to get. If they deserve compassion and rahmah, Allah will give them that mercy in the grave, in the barzakh, on the day of judgment. But if they deserve the anger of Allah, if they deserve the wrath of Allah, if they deserve to go into hell and to burn for eternity, then that is what Allah will give to them, because that is what they deserved based on their actions in this world. And as tonight, as I conclude, as we remember the grandson of Rasulullah, Imam Hassan ibn Ali al-Mujtaba alayhi salatu wassalam, we recognize that there were people around Imam Hassan that we ourselves never ask Allah to give them His mercy. There were people around Imam Hassan alayhi salam who we ask from Allah that these people were so deserving of your punishment that Allah, we ask you to deal with them with your justice. And these are the people that brought Imam Hassan alayhi salam that poison that killed him. Brothers and sisters, it is on a night like this, it was in the month of Safar. Historians differ whether it was at the 7th of Safar or was it at the end of the month on the 28th of Safar. But whatever the case may be, historians are unanimous that Imam Hassan alayhi salam, the grandson of Rasulullah, not only the grandson of the Prophet, but the one whom the Quran called as the son of Rasulullah, that he left this world. And he didn't leave this world in a peaceful state. No, just like his father, he was the victim of what we would call terrorism. Just like his younger brother, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he would face a very tragic death. As we know, brothers and sisters, that the Ahlul Bayt alayhum salam, that they suffered during the entire course of their lives. They suffered to promote, to protect, and to propagate the message of the Quran. And even in their death, they suffered. Historians tell us that Imam Hassan alayhi salam, a man who was known for his generosity, a man who was so generous that he's called the Kareem of Ahlul Bayt. They say that twice in his entire life, he took his entire net worth and he divided it in two, and he gave half of his wealth in the way of Allah. Imam Hassan alayhi salam, a man who went for Hajj, not once, not twice, but 25 times. And he went for Hajj 25 times, walking barefoot from Medina to Mecca. And he would say that I feel humbled before my Lord that I should go to His house on an animal or with shoes, that I have to humble myself in front of my Creator. A man with such generosity, with such love and benevolence, that he would be seen giving to the needy, that he would be seen, even though he was being insulted and humiliated, he would be seen giving love. When people would come and insult him and mock him and insult him, he would still ask them, are you a stranger? Do you need something? Can I give you food? Can I give you a place to stay? Can I give you some money to continue on your journey? A man like this, brothers and sisters, Imam Hassan, as he was having to go through the tragedies of losing his father, Amir al-Mu'mineen, when Imam Ali was murdered in the Masjid of Kufa, as Imam Hassan alayhi salam takes over the imamat after the Shahadat of Amir al-Mu'mineen, for that next 10 or so years, he suffers tragedy after tragedy. He suffers the humiliation that people try to impose upon him. He suffers the fate of having to sign a peace treaty with the people of Sham. He suffers the fact that people would come in front of him and insult his father, Amir al-Mu'mineen. He suffers the fact that people would stand in front of him and begin to insult his father. They would insult him to his face. But eventually, brothers and sisters, the situation became such for Imam Hassan that as he's in the city of Medina, and the peace treaty that he had signed with Muawiyah had been broken, all of the conditions that Muawiyah had initially agreed upon, where he promised that he would not give the Khilafah to anybody after his death, where Muawiyah promised he would govern by the Sunnah, by the tradition of the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah, where he promised he would not curse Amir al-Mu'mineen, where he promised protection for the followers. All of these conditions have been broken one after the other by Muawiyah. Eventually it got to a point where Muawiyah recognizes that Imam Hassan, that he is still a thorn in his side and that he has to do away with him. But how does Muawiyah go towards Imam Hassan? How does he begin to launch this attack to do away with Imam Hassan? He recognizes that in the family of Imam Hassan, that the wife of Imam Hassan, Ja'da, that she has a hatred for her husband. Although she's married into the house of Nubuwah, she's married into the grandson of the Prophet, but she has a hatred for her husband. She has an enmity for her husband. Eventually it comes out that Muawiyah sends a letter to Ja'da. He says to her, he says that do away with your husband and I promise you many things. He says, I promise you 10,000 dirhams. He says, I promise you the hand of my son Yazid in marriage, that you will become the queen of the entire Muslim empire. And as Ja'da hears all of these promises from Muawiyah, and as she has a hatred for her husband, she accepts this opportunity. Historians say that Ja'da, she takes this poison from Muawiyah, this poison which was a brutal poison, and she administers it into the food of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. Historians say that of all of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt that had ever been poisoned, whether that be the poisoned sword of Ibn Muljim la'natullah alayh, whether that be the poison of the fourth Imam, the fifth Imam, the sixth Imam, any of the Imams that were given, that the poison which the second Imam was made to consume was one of the most strongest. They say that as the Imam took this poison, that the poison began to act in his body. It became to a point, brothers and sisters, when Imam Hassan is in his room in the city of Medina, he's on his deathbed. Imam Hussein alayhi salam is beside his brother. As Imam Hassan begins to cough, historians say the blood is coming up from his throat. They say that the insides of his body are being ripped and torn apart by the poison that's been running through his body. At one point, Imam Hassan looks to his brother Imam Hussein, who's sitting beside him. He says to Imam Hussein, he says, oh, my brother Hussein, go and bring me a bowl. Imam Hussein goes and fetches a bowl. He gives it to Imam Hassan. Every time Imam Hassan would cough into the bowl, they say that blood would be coming out of his throat. And as that blood would come out of his throat, his body would become weaker and weaker. His brother Abu Abdullah is sitting beside him, seeing the state of his older brother going through all this tragedy. Imam Hussein is weeping. Imam Hussein begins to cry. He can't bear to see the sight of his brother. But at one point, brothers and sisters, Imam Hassan says to his brother, Ya Abu Abdullah, he says, why are you crying? Why are you in this state? And Imam Hussein says, oh my dear brother, how could I not cry by seeing your state? How can I not see you in this state with the poison making its way through your body, with your blood coming out from your throat like this? Imam Hassan, in the state that he's in, the state of complete powerlessness, the state that he's in, says to his brother, he says that don't worry, my brother. He says that our grandfather Rasulullah told me about this day, but what I even have tragedy for, what I have tears for, he says, is that day, Abu Abdullah, when 30,000 people from the nation of our grandfather will be raising their swords, when they will be fighting against you, all of them claiming to be following the sunnah of our grandfather, all of them seeking proximity to Allah, and their swords will be against you, Ya Abu Abdullah. Imam Hassan says that there is no day like your day, Abu Abdullah. The tears for me are meaningless. We should be shedding tears for you. And as Imam Hassan says this, a knock comes at the door. Who is at the door? It's none other than the sister Bibi Zainab alayhi salam. Sayyidah Zainab wants to come into the door in the room to see her brother Imam Hassan. Imam Hassan tells Hussein, he says that cover that bowl. Cover the bowl. I don't want Sayyidah Zainab, I don't want our sister to see the state that I'm in. But brothers and sisters, let me end with this, that Imam Hassan was so concerned concerned for Sayyidah Zainab, for her to see the little blood that was coming from his body that was in that bowl. He was so concerned about Sayyidah Zainab and what she would feel seeing her brother in that state on that bed. But how could Sayyidah Zainab, how would she be on that day of Ashura, seeing Abul Fadl Abbas alayhi salam in his hands being taken on the day of Ashura? How would she be seeing Ali al-Akbar on the day of Ashura? How would she be seeing Qasim, the son of Imam Hassan, on that day of Ashura? How would she be seeing the headless body of Abu Abdullah on the plains of Ashura? How would she be seeing all of that loss of all of the family and the friends on the plains of Karbala on the 10th of Muharram? وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّ لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam to accept this act of worship from us tonight. Ya Allah, we ask you to accept this act of worship and to allow us to make our way to Jannatul Baqi. Whereas millions of Zawar tonight are going towards Karbala, towards Abu Abdullah for the Arba'een, we remember Imam Hassan alayhi salam buried in Jannatul Baqi, not having the permission to have the Zawar to come to his grave, not having the right to have the dhari over the grave, not having the right to have a golden dome over his grave like his brother has in Karbala. Ya Allah, we ask by the right of Muhammad and Muhammad to free the land of the Hijaz and to allow there to be the respect given to Muhammad and those pious individuals buried in Jannatul Baqi. Ya Allah, we ask you to give us the ability to have the ziyarat of Imam Hassan alayhi salam and his family buried in Jannatul Baqi in this dunya. And we ask you to allow us to have their shafa'at on the day of resurrection and to be allowed to walk into Jannah in the company of Imam Hassan alayhi salatu wassalam and the family. Ya Allah, we ask you that many of our community members in this community, many communities around the world are sick, are suffering. They're in need of du'as. Ya Allah, we ask for the right of Imam Hassan alayhi salam and his madlumiyah to grant a speedy shafa'at and a full recovery to all of those who are suffering. Ya Allah, we ask you to keep all of us on the path of Muhammad and Muhammad, especially our young men and young women. Ya Allah, we ask you to grant all of us the ability to turn back to you in repentance and to be your true and sincere servants. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.